Oh, and good evening. It's January 2nd, 2025, and welcome to another one of our branches on the vine with another episode from those folks at Aleph Beta. I enjoy the connections across Scripture and the need for those connections. Here at the Dusty Feet, we sometimes refer to those connections as echoes. Connected thinking. One, where have you heard that before? And two, how might they relate? So Rabbi David Fohrman has another engaging series of videos on biblical echoes. The Book of the Maccabees. So on the heels of Hanukkah, I think it just fit right in. So welcome this evening to another thought-provoking journey from Aleph Beta, Biblical Echoes, Book of the Maccabees, on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, you click the subscribe button. Those reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, click the like button, because YouTube will share these to those people if they wish. Biblical Echoes, Book of the Maccabees. So, this is going to be a 4-part series, so I hope it will be an engaging journey as we read about and listen to these echoes. I think many are unfamiliar with the Book of the Maccabees. I suspect many will hear this part of the story for the first time. But I am compelled to believe that it is a journey worth taking. If you choose to make it to part 4, there's a connection that I suspect you're not ready for. Oppression, tax collectors, deceit, slavery, storehouse, Moses, Saul, and possibly an echo to the Messiah. At a minimum, an introduction as to why we are there in that story. But the events in the first book of the Maccabees occur between the last prophet, Malachi, and the Gospels pickup of the story of the Messiah. That's approximately a 400-year gap. A lot can happen in 400 years. So this is part 1. We're going to begin the journey. Listen, open your minds, and see if you can recognize the connections the rabbi mentions. Would you have seen them too? Enjoy the video.
Hi everybody, this is Rabbi David Fohrman, and welcome to Aleph Beta. So somewhere in my room I have a yellow newspaper, an original copy of the San Francisco Chronicle from August 15th, 1945. I had picked it up when I was a kid for a few dollars from a souvenir shop. Emblazoned on the front in huge letters is the word peace with an exclamation mark. This, of course, is the paper that records Japan's unconditional surrender at the end of World War II. Every once in a while I find myself leafing through its pages, reading not just the articles that have to do with the end of the war, but the other stuff. Even the ads, the business news of the day. It just has this way of transporting you back to another time. And you can read history in secondary sources like textbooks. But when you hold a newspaper in your hand, you hold a diary in your hand, you're there. It's a whole different experience. Hanukkah is nearly upon us. Usually, when we think about Hanukkah, when we read about it, we're reading secondary sources of history. Even if you're going back to the Babylonian Talmud itself, that's still a secondary work. The Talmud talks about Hanukkah, but the Talmud was written a good 500, 600, 700 years after the events of Hanukkah actually took place. Is there a primary source? What did Hanukkah look like to those who lived through the actual events? In this series of videos, I want to do something a little bit different than we've done before in Aleph Beta. I want to study a work with you. It's a historical work. The work is known as the Book of the Maccabees. We do not know its author, but scholars pretty unanimously believe that the book was written shortly after the victory of the Maccabees, possibly by the official scribe in the court of the kings of the Hashmonaim themselves. Judaism does not regard the Book of the Maccabees as a prophetic work, but at the very least, it's kind of like a diary of the events from those who lived through them. We're going to be looking at the Book of the Maccabees, the first book of Maccabees to be precise, because there are two of them, and we're going to try to explore the book with an eye towards figuring out how they, the Maccabees themselves, understood the meaning of their own struggle. Let me just set the scene for you here. The action in the Book of the Maccabees takes place in the middle of the Second Temple period. If you think about the holiday of Purim as the nearest cousin to Hanukkah, Purim took place well before Hanukkah. Back in Purim times, Israel was exiled from its land and found itself in Persia when they faced the menace of Haman and the possibility of genocide. But now it's a couple centuries later. The people of Israel have come back to the land, they've established a second temple, but Persia, meanwhile, has faded as a world power. It's been vanquished by Greece and the forces of Alexander the Great. But now, though, a new threat has emerged on the horizon. It's the successors of Alexander. While Alexander himself was somewhat friendly towards the nation of Israel, Alexander's successors were less kindly disposed to us. The Book of Maccabees will tell the story of a steadily growing campaign of oppression waged by Antiochus, a Syrian Greek king who is an heir to part of Alexander's kingdom. Antiochus, as you might know, is also aided in his oppression by Greek sympathizers within the Jewish people, Jews who were known as Hellenists, who advocated assimilation to Greek culture. Anyway, the book of 1 Maccabees picks up from that moment, more or less, that Antiochus begins his terrible campaign. He raids the temple, he plunders its riches, and then, 2 years later, he returns to wreak even more havoc. Here's how the book of Maccabees puts it. 2 years later, the king sent the Mysian commander to the cities of Judah. And he, that Mysian commander, he came to Jerusalem with a strong force. He spoke to them peacefully, but deceitfully, and they believed him. Then he attacked the city suddenly in a great onslaught and destroyed many of the people in Israel. He plundered the city and set fire to it, demolished its houses and its surrounding walls, and they took captive the women and the children. I want to go back and look at this with you. Who was it who did all this damage to Jerusalem? You know, the author of Maccabees tells us that Antiochus had sent the Mysian commander, whoever that is, to do it. Well, who is that? So the Mysians, they were mercenary soldiers, they came from Asia Minor. Apparently Antiochus had hired a bunch of them to carry out this terrible and ruthless, brutal campaign against Jerusalem. Not very nice, but at least that reading of the Book of Maccabees makes sense. You can understand what it's saying. But now I'm going to give you another reading that doesn't make sense. You know, here's the problem. When you and I are reading the Book of the Maccabees, we're actually reading it in translation. It was written in Hebrew, but the problem is you can't get to the Hebrew because the original Hebrew of the Book of Maccabees has been lost to us over time. The closest thing we have to the original now is a Greek translation of the work. And if you aren't fluent in Greek, you're forced to rely on English translations of that Greek translation. Those lines that I read to you, they come from a fairly modern English translation of 1 Maccabees, a translation that was done in just 2010 from the Greek, and it's used by a modern scholar, a guy by the name of Daniel Harrington. However, this is not the only translation of 1 Maccabees available. One of the earliest English translations of 1 Maccabees is the King James Version, and there, the line I read you is portrayed in a radically different way. In the King James Version, it says that Antiochus did not send Mysians to Jerusalem. It says he sent tax collectors to Jerusalem. Listen to how it sounds now. First, those tax collectors, they spoke peacefully and reassuringly, but all of that was actually deceitful. Because shortly after, these tax collectors, they attacked the city, plundered it, set fire to it, took women and children captive to be sold as slaves. And now you're reading this King James Version here with the tax collectors instead of Mysians, and you're saying to yourself, who did all of this? Some tax collectors? Really? It's like, imagine, one day you get a knock at the door and there's an IRS agent there. And then he takes out a machine gun and he just mows down everybody in the house. He and his friends, the other tax collectors, they start throwing grenades up and down the block. They kill half the people in the town, sell women and children as slaves. It's like, what kind of tax collectors are these? Tax collectors are like mid-level bureaucrats, like Forrest Gump types. They're not like some sort of mercenary army out to rape, pillage, and kill. So you can see now why later translators, like this 2010 translation and others, would be tempted to sort of get rid of the tax collectors, because Mycenaeans, these guys were mercenary soldiers. The text actually makes sense. But the problem is, what did the original Greek say? I mean, if the original Greek said tax collectors, then Harrington doesn't get to change it to Mycenaeans just because he's an academic and gets poetic license or something. So here actually is how Harrington explains himself about all of this. Harrington admits that the Greek version of the text really had tax collector, but he thinks the Greek translator got it wrong. He suspects that the original Hebrew was Sare Mem Samach Yud Mem. Now he says the Greek translator read that as Sare Misim, which would mean tax collectors, but Harrington says that the context proves that wrong. Why would nice, mild-mannered tax collectors go on a killing rampage? So Harrington says the original Hebrew should be read not as Sare Misim, but as Sare Musim, which would mean Mycenaean officers. Mycenaean mercenaries would certainly be the kind of folks to go on a rampage. So this whole idea of using tax collectors in the translation, that's all just an unfortunate but understandable mistake. But here's what I'd like to suggest. What if the Greek translator got it right? What if Harrington is the one who got it wrong? If that was the original Hebrew text, Sare Mem Samach Yud Mem, that recalls something for us. In the Jewish experience, Sare Misim are the very original bad guys in our national history, going all the way back to our very first oppression in the land of Egypt. The text tells us in Exodus, Vayasimu alav sare misim lama'an anoto besivlotam. The Egyptians, they placed upon us tax collectors to oppress us with their burdens. It all began with those darn tax collectors. Ramban explains that the original descent into slavery back in Egypt, it took place deceptively. You can't just take a peaceful, law-abiding immigrant population and enslave them out of the blue. Instead, Pharaoh started by levying taxes against the Hebrews. But all that was just a ruse. Gradually, those taxes grew more onerous, and then Pharaoh unleashed other deceptive measures upon the Hebrews. Before they knew it, the Hebrews were slaves. It seems like the author of the Book of Maccabees wants to take us on a covert literary journey all the way back to Egypt. The word Sare Misim is a code word for the beginning of a dreadful Egypt-like experience. And the Book of the Maccabees seems to tell us that an Egypt-like experience happened to the Jews too, centuries later, this time at the hands of Antiochus. In Egypt, first there were tax collectors, but they were deceptive, and before you knew it, everyone was slaves. And here in the Book of the Maccabees, first there were tax collectors, then they were deceptive. Before you knew it, women and children were being sold as slaves. It's like it was all happening again. The echoes of Egypt in the Book of Maccabees seem like they're real. Now, if you doubt me, if you think this is all just a figment of my imagination, the echoes of Egypt actually continue. Go back to Egypt for a minute. What happened after the tax collectors gave way to slavery? The very next thing we hear about in the text is Vayiven Ari Miskanot Lapara. The people were forced to build these great storehouses for Pharaoh. Now go to the Book of the Maccabees. After the tax collectors give way to pillaging the populace with women and children sold as slaves, the next thing the Book of Maccabees tells us is that Syrian forces co-opted Hebrews and forced them to build a fortress, a citadel, that would be used as a huge storehouse for the Syrian Greeks. So all in all, these parallels, tax collectors, deception, slavery, building the storehouses, it doesn't seem to be a coincidence. What I want to do with you in the next video is to keep on reading the Book of the Maccabees and see if we can find continuing parallels to the Egypt story. If we do, we're going to need to chart them carefully and then ask ourselves, why is this all here? Why did the author of the book of Maccabees want to remind us, his reader, of the story of Egyptian slavery? How might these parallels help us understand how the Maccabees viewed their own struggle? And how might that, in turn, help us understand how we are meant to relate to the great miracles of Hanukkah today?
So what'd you think? So remember, Hanukkah's just a label, right? That name refers to a whole complex story. That's just one sticker we use. Everything leading up to the miracle is significant. Still, we sometimes don't take the time to consider those that discussed direction and those previous events that have the impact on this story. Because we do have a miracle with the candles and the menorah, but the story that leads up to it is so tied to the history of the entire children of Israel. So maybe it would be a disservice not to look into this and see if we see any connections between those biblical echoes, those red strings that tie so much of the stories of the Father that guide us to his Son. And as we study these wonderful pieces of literature, that they all connect us to the Messiah. So here's a tiny little note that I want to insert here before we dig in deep. And it's a little bit about where he's setting the tone, and he mentions the Hellenists. Interestingly, during this time, there was a conflict amongst the Jews regarding how they wanted to practice what they were doing, right? Okay, that might be a little confusing. It just kind of works out that this way that you have one group, right, that's saying that we don't want to assimilate into Greek culture, and there's another group that they feel they need to assimilate to Greek culture. Those are the Hellenists, right? The ones similar to Greek culture, Hellenists. Okay, so remember that we have this internal sub-struggle going on that's going to run this current for a long, long, long time. So sometimes we just want to keep that in your mind as we walk through all of this. Just something to be aware of. Let's continue. So what do you think about that little part where he discussed the Mycenaean commander versus tax collector? I mean, during our studies with Skip Moen, we're very aware of translation challenges and how things are read. Yeah. So, did you notice that one of the challenges you have here is the same consonant structure, right? Just with different vowel structures. The variance comes with the vowels, those jots and tittles that are below. So, when you change a few vowels, the word changes and possible connections change. This drives us to think about things that we're looking forward to and we're looking back on. So we hear them differently. And if we know we can look at them differently, I suspect most have not considered this, and I appreciate the rabbi's candor in bringing up this option, and then its impact on our thinking. It's not to take, I don't want to do too much of a detour here, just one to think about. Because I think maybe this will give us a better glimpse maybe into people's disdain for tax collectors in future stories. Because it's more than just collecting money to be handed over to whomever you're collecting for. In the history that goes with this, maybe there's deeper, a more impactful view that folks will have towards tax collectors. And it does make you wonder just how hard it might have been for them to deal with Matthew. I think they do a fascinating job of broaching this particular topic when we see the conflict in the Dallas Jenkins created series, The Chosen. And we see Peter's personal conflict with Matthew. So maybe this adds a little meat to the story. Let's move on. I would be surprised if people remembered that this drew them back to Egypt, the tax collectors in Egypt. I suspect we didn't, which makes this all the more intriguing since we like these connections. This is just one that caught my attention, so maybe we might want to look for more. You know these stories, the stories told in the book of the Maccabees? For them, those are closest to the event, looking back and telling us the story. It's possible that it could be those who actually experienced a bit of that firsthand. Again, like the rabbi said, we have no proof of that at all, but I know at least for them, it's a lot closer for them then than especially us today, 2,500 years later. Interesting. They look back on their history and connect those events to how they viewed them when they're telling their story. What questions then do I need to ask about the events as they unfold, right? Are they cautionary tales? Are they tales that cause us to remember? Are they tales that prepare us to think about the future? Can we get this collection of words as we work our way down the story, right? Like I started with, oppression, tax collectors, deceit, slavery, storehouse. And just wait until we get the connections to Moses and to Saul. It really does give us something to ponder as we look at the story of the book of the Maccabees. I believe it sets the stage for and introduces us to the setting that we're introduced when we start those gospel accounts. So let's see where it takes us. This journey should be fun. This is part 1 of 4. I hope you stick with us. So, shalom, shalom. And thanks for being with us tonight for another episode of Branches on the Vine with Rabbi David Fohrman on the Dusty Feet.